There is a document I keep in a drawer beside my desk. Not on the network, not in any archive the throne would think to search. Just a physical sheet of pressed fiber paper that I had the station printer run off on a Tuesday morning 7 years ago, before the feeds went quiet, and before the shooting started, and before the throne discovered, one expensive lesson at a time, what it means to declare war on a species that has spent 3 generations learning how to make itself indispensable. The document is a copy of the official throne broadcast, the War Declaration. It went out on all channels at 6:14 station time, full ceremonial formatting, the sovereign's personal cipher block at the top, the golden seal of the Hegemon Throne rendered in whatever the Verk equivalent of ink is, and below the seal, in the language of High Court, the following announcement: that the sovereign Hegemon Vareth XIII, holder of the 7 arcs, protector of the inner reaches, had formally declared a state of war against the human polity, had authorized the mobilization of the 1st Consolidated Battle Group, the 2nd Reaches Fleet, and the Merchant Interdiction Corps, and had directed all loyal subjects of the throne to treat human nationals as enemy combatants effective immediately upon receipt. I read it 3 times when it came through. Then I made myself a cup of tea, because that is the kind of man I am, and I sat at the narrow window of my quarters in Way Station Dreveth and watched the throne's courier ships begin to move. I want to be precise about something. I was not afraid. I was not even particularly surprised. I had been sitting in that Way Station for 14 months, officially as a trade compliance observer attached to the Rithani Merchant Compact, unofficially as the senior intelligence field officer for a project that did not have a name in any directory I could access, only a case number, and whose purpose was so straightforward that it had taken me some months to understand why anyone had felt the need to classify it at all. The project stripped to its foundation was this: map everything. Map every contract. Map every supply line. Map every maintenance agreement and fuel depot lease and communications, relay licensing arrangement and agricultural import schedule and medical supply chain and orbital station keeping service that ran through human hands, human ships, human-built infrastructure, or human technical knowledge. Map which throne systems depended on human cargo pilots because the throne had not trained enough of its own. Map which throne agricultural worlds had adopted human crop rotation methods because the Verk approach produced 20% less yield. Map which throne communications relays had been upgraded using human-licensed compression protocols because the alternative was 3 times more expensive. Map which throne naval engineers quietly used human-designed coolant systems on their warships because the Verk native equivalent corroded at high heat. Map all of it, every thread, every dependency, every quiet arrangement where someone in the throne had looked at a human option and chosen it, not because they loved humans, but because humans had gotten there first and done it better or cheaper, and the throne was, like every large empire, fundamentally lazy about the things that worked. I want to explain what that mapping actually looked like, because it is easy to describe the project in its summary form and lose the texture of what 14 months in a way station produces in a man. The way station was not a glamorous posting. Dreveth sat at the junction of 2 minor transit corridors, minor by throne standards, which meant they handled roughly 400 cargo transits per standard week, and its primary function was administrative processing, import declarations, cargo manifests, tariff assessments. The Rithani Compact maintained a small trade office there, and it was under that trade office's cover that I had been installed with a workstation, a relay tap I had spent 3 days in month 2 hiding inside a maintenance conduit, and a very large number of forms to process. The forms were useful, actually. Not in the cover sense. The throne's customs officials paid very little attention to a compact compliance observer dutifully reviewing tariff classifications, but in the intelligence sense. A cargo manifest is a document of extraordinary density. It tells you not just what is moving, but where it is going, and where it came from, and under what licensing arrangement, and at what price, and on what schedule. 14 months of cargo manifests, processed and cross-referenced with the technical specification documents that move through the same channels, the maintenance contracts filed with the Compact's arbitration registry, the service agreements logged in the Throne's own commercial database, which was accessible to licensed trade observers in its unclassified tier, gave me a picture of the Throne's dependency architecture that I doubt any single office inside the Throne itself had assembled. This was not because the Throne was unintelligent about its own infrastructure. It was because large bureaucratic organizations do not naturally produce complete cross-departmental pictures of their own dependencies. The Agriculture Ministry knows about the agricultural licensing agreements. The Communications Ministry knows about the relay protocols. The Naval Engineering Directorate knows about the coolant systems. No one is sitting in a room looking at all three and thinking about what happens if the common thread is removed, because removing the common thread is not, in normal times, something anyone has a reason to think about. I was the person sitting in that room, which in this case was a waystation office that smelled faintly of the chemical treatment used on transit cargo containers. I was thinking about it because it was my job to think about it, and because someone, somewhere up my chain of reporting, had understood that this question was worth thinking about before the situation required it rather than after. My network of observers contributed to the picture. I want to be clear that this network was not what a novelist might envision. There were no secret meetings in low-lit freight corridors, no dead drops, no dramatic brush passes of classified material. The people who fed me information were, almost entirely, people who worked in ordinary commercial roles. A fuel depot supervisor on a transit corridor, 3 hops from Drevith who filed her routine inventory reports through the Compact's arbitration registry, and who had over time begun including informal notes about system anomalies, because she had worked in fuel logistics for 20 years and took professional pride in complete records. A calibration technician on a Throne agricultural station who had asked me, in month 4, whether I could help him track down a licensing question about his crop planning software, and who subsequently became an inadvertent but reliable source of information about the software's actual deployment depth across the agricultural network. A communications relay maintenance crew supervisor, whose name I will not record here even now, who had been filing informal complaints about relay protocol inefficiencies to the Compact's Technical Standards Committee for years, complaints which the committee had not acted on but which I had read carefully, and which told me a great deal about which relay infrastructure ran on human license protocols and how critical those protocols were to bandwidth. None of these people knew they were sources. They were doing their jobs and in the process producing information that passed through channels I was authorized to monitor. This is, in my experience, where the best intelligence comes from, not from people who are trying to tell you something, but from people who are trying to do something else and generating an accurate record of reality in the process. By month 12, my accumulated picture was substantial enough that I wrote the summary. The summary said, in effect, the Throne cannot maintain its inner reaches infrastructure for more than 4 months without human participation, and this dependence is distributed across at least 11 distinct ministry portfolios, none of which has full visibility into the others, and the force majeure clauses in the relevant human licensing agreements are standard commercial language that would trigger automatically under a hostile designation decree. And this means that a formal war declaration would not open a military campaign. It would open an infrastructure crisis for the declaring power, beginning within hours of the decree, accelerating over weeks, becoming critical within 3 to 4 months. I sent that summary. I received an acknowledgement. I was told to continue mapping and to maintain cover, and to make no contact with any human nationals currently operating in Throne space. The last instruction was the interesting one: make no contact, not begin preparations, not develop options. Not, work with our people inside throne space to preposition. Just, keep watching, keep recording, do not touch anything. I thought about that instruction for some time after receiving it. It told me several things. It told me that the decision about what to do with the picture I had been building was being made at a level above my reporting chain. It told me that the decision had already been made, or nearly made, and that what was needed from me was not action but witness. And it told me, this last part I had to hold carefully, because certainty in intelligence work is a vice, that the people making the decision were prepared for the possibility of the war declaration, had been prepared for some time, and were allowing things to develop to a point before they responded, or before they allowed the commercial logic to run, or before they did whatever it was they had decided to do. I was not told what they had decided to do. I was told to watch. So I watched. The war declaration arrived 14 months into my posting, on a Tuesday morning, at 6:14 station time. I finished my tea. I sent a single-line confirmation to the case number's routing address. Declaration confirmed, DREVTH station, 621 local. Then I sat back and waited because there was nothing else to do. Whatever was going to happen would happen at a scale and a speed, and in locations I could not see from a way station window, and my job at that point was not to act but to watch and to record. Let me tell you what I watched. By 900, the first anomaly reports were coming in from Throne administrative channels I monitored through the relay tap I had installed in month 3. A logistics depot on the outer edge of the Vethani transit corridor was reporting that its automated fuel dispensing system had issued an error code. The system had been built and licensed by a human engineering firm. The licensing agreement included a remote maintenance clause. The remote maintenance clause had been quietly deactivated at 6:17, 3 minutes after the war declaration went out. By 1100, a second anomaly, a Throne agricultural world in the Middle Reaches, was reporting that its crop planning software had stopped accepting updates. The software was a human-developed yield optimization suite that 17 Throne agricultural worlds had licensed over the prior decade. It was not weapons software. It was not military software. It was software that told farmers when to plant and how to rotate and which fields to let lie fallow for a season. It stopped accepting updates at 619. By 1300, a pattern was forming, and the Throne's administrative channels were starting to sound different. Not panicked, not yet, but the specific, careful tone of bureaucratic language when bureaucrats are beginning to understand that a problem is larger than the forms they have available to describe it. The fuel dispensing anomalies had spread to 3 depots. The crop planning software outage had hit 11 of 17 licensed worlds. A medical supply chain serving 4 Throne interior systems had issued a routing failure, not a shortage, just a routing failure. A logistics management platform that had also been human licensed and had also gone quiet at 6:17. A communications relay in the Drevith sector, which I could actually see from my window on a clear day, had dropped to reduced capacity. Not offline. Reduced. The human-licensed compression protocols were no longer updating their encryption keys, and without current encryption keys, the relay could still carry traffic, but at a fraction of its rated bandwidth. I made a note in my log. Compression relay DREVTH sector 1247, REDUCED capacity still functional. I was thorough. That was my job. I want to describe what the afternoon felt like. Sitting in that way station office, watching the anomaly reports accumulate. There is a particular quality to watching a large system fail in slow motion that I find difficult to put into words without sounding either more dramatic or more detached than the reality warrants. I was not triumphant. I was not frightened. I was focused, in the way that a man who has spent 14 months preparing to watch something specific watches it when it finally happens. With careful attention, and with the slightly unsettling sensation of seeing your own map become the territory. Each anomaly report confirmed a dependency I had mapped. Each confirmation was, in one sense, professionally satisfying. The map was accurate. The picture was correct. In another sense, each confirmation was a reminder that the things being degraded were real systems serving real populations. The fuel that warships needed, yes, but also the fuel that freighters needed to move food and medicine. The agricultural software that throne farmers depended on for their planting schedules. The medical routing platform that got supplies to people who needed them. The throne had declared war. The force majeure clauses had triggered. The consequences were not limited to the throne's military capacity. I noted all of this in my logs. I was thorough about the humanitarian dimensions as well as the military ones. My job was to observe and record, and the humanitarian dimensions were part of what I was observing. By 1800, the throne's administrative traffic had changed in character entirely. The careful bureaucratic understatement was gone. What replaced it was not panic. The throne's administrative class was too well trained for naked panic on an official channel, but a kind of compressed urgency, the language of people who have been asked to explain something that does not fit into the categories they were given, and have decided to solve this problem by using a lot of very long words very quickly. The fuel depots, 17 anomalies now, spread across 6 transit corridors. The agricultural systems, all 17 licensed worlds, plus 3 that had been running pirated versions of the software and were now also experiencing failures, which I noted with a certain professional appreciation for the completeness of it. The medical routing platform, expanded to 9 systems, still not a shortage, still just routing failures, but 9 systems of medical supply logistics running on degraded protocols, was the kind of thing that became a shortage in 3 to 4 months if nothing changed. The communications relays, 41 of the 63 relays in the Inner Reaches network were running on reduced capacity. Not offline, reduced. Still functional but slow, and in a civilization that ran its commerce and its fleet coordination on communications infrastructure, slow was a word that had consequences. And then there were the warships. The first consolidated battle group had begun its mobilization as directed. Its flagship, the Sovereign Reach, was a vessel I had looked up in the Throne's published naval registry. It was equipped with the Werk Standard drive configuration, and also, as I had noted in month 9 of my posting when a technical specification had passed through a shipping manifest I was monitoring, with a human-licensed coolant system for the secondary drive array. Not the primary, the secondary. The Throne's naval engineers had adopted it 4 years prior, because the Werk native equivalent was developing stress fractures at sustained high heat, and the human design ran cooler and had a longer service interval. At 1843, the Sovereign Reach reported a secondary array anomaly. The drive did not fail. I want to be precise about that. The coolant system did not shut down, did not rupture, did not do anything dramatic. The maintenance monitoring software that the human manufacturer had included as part of the licensing package, the software that tracked coolant temperature and pressure and flagged when service was required, stopped transmitting its routine status reports. Nothing broke. The ship simply no longer had an automated early warning system for the one component of its secondary array that, if it developed a stress fracture at high heat, would require the array to be taken offline for between 3 and 6 weeks for inspection and repair. The Sovereign Reach could still fly. It could still fight. It simply had to do so knowing that if its secondary array started developing a problem, it would not know until the problem was large enough to show up in manual inspection, which was performed on a 60-day cycle. The battle group's commanding admiral filed an anomaly report at 1902. The report was, by the standards of the Throne's administrative language, remarkably brief. It said, licensing anomalies affecting maintenance monitoring systems across multiple vessel classes. Requesting technical guidance. Estimating reduced operational readiness for extended engagement pending resolution. I read that report and thought, there it is, that is the word, readiness. A fleet that did not know the health of its own systems could still sail. It could still fire its weapons. It could do all the things a fleet was supposed to do in the short term, in a clean engagement where nothing went wrong. But a fleet preparing for a sustained campaign against a species it had just declared war on needed to know, with some confidence, that its ships would function 6 months from now, and the quietly deactivated maintenance monitoring software was the thing that provided that confidence, and now it was gone. I finished my evening meal. I sent my nightly summary to the case number's routing address, a summary that was considerably longer than usual and which I filed under the heading Anomaly Accumulation, Day 1. Then I went asleep, because whatever was going to happen next was going to take some time, and a man who cannot sleep in a crisis is not going to be much use to anyone when the crisis requires clear thinking. Let me compress the next several weeks. The Throne's response to the simultaneous deactivation of its licensed human systems was, in the immediate term, approximately what you would expect from a large and well-organized bureaucratic empire that had just discovered a problem it had not anticipated. It convened committees. It issued directives. It assigned technical working groups to assess each category of anomaly and report back with options. It did all of this with the thoroughness and procedural correctness that a civilization that had maintained a regional empire for 4 centuries brought to any significant challenge. And in doing so it discovered, one working group at a time, something that my 14-month map had already established. The dependencies were not superficial. The fuel dispensing software was not the problem. The fuel dispensing software was a symptom. The underlying problem was that the Throne had, over 3 generations of commercial interaction with humanity, come to rely on human-originated technical infrastructure at a depth that no individual ministry or department had ever fully documented, because each individual ministry or department had only ever seen its own slice of it. The agricultural world licensing was an agriculture ministry matter. The medical routing platform was a health administration matter. The communications relay compression protocols were a communications ministry matter. The coolant system maintenance software was a naval engineering matter. Nobody had ever sat in a room and looked at all of it at once. I had sat in a room and looked at all of it at once. That was my job. The committees discovered things that I had already mapped. They discovered that the fuel dispensing anomalies could be resolved, eventually, by reverting to the older Verk native systems, but that the older systems required a different grade of fuel additive that was itself supplied through a distribution network partially managed by a human logistics firm. They discovered that the agricultural software could be replaced, but that the Verk-developed alternative had not been maintained in 8 years and would require significant redevelopment before it could match the feature set that the licensed human version had provided. They discovered that the communications relay compression protocols could be renegotiated, but that the human firm that held the protocol license was, as of the date of the war declaration, classified as an enemy entity under the sovereign's decree, and therefore the Throne's trade ministry was not authorized to enter into licensing negotiations with them without a specific exemption from the sovereign's office, which required a petition, a review, and a formal ruling. A process that typically took between 3 and 7 months. There is a particular kind of institutional frustration that sets in when a large organization discovers that its own rules are the mechanism preventing it from solving its own problems. I monitored the Throne's administrative channels through all of it. The language became, in certain corridors, remarkably undiplomatic for a civilization that prized formal precision. I noted several instances of senior administrators describing the situation in terms that the Throne's official style guide would not have approved. I want to pause here and describe what the Throne's committee experience actually looked like at the working level, because I think it is instructive in a way that the high-level summary does not fully capture. I had, through my relay tap and through the Compact's arbitration registry, access to a significant volume of working group traffic, not classified deliberations, but the administrative correspondence that flows around working groups, the scheduling communications, the draft terms of reference, the requests for technical input sent to contractors and subject matter experts. This correspondence has a texture that the formal reports do not, and the texture was illuminating. The Fuel Depot Working Group, for example, was staffed by competent people. The Throne's logistics directorate was not incompetent. It had managed the fuel supply chains for an inner reaches empire for 4 centuries, and it knew its business. The people assigned to the working group understood fueling infrastructure. What they did not understand, initially, was that the fuel dispensing software anomaly was not a technical problem in the conventional sense, a corrupted file, a hardware fault, a compatibility issue between system versions. It was a licensing problem, and licensing problems live in a different part of the bureaucratic architecture from technical problems. The Fuel Depot Working Group spent its first week trying to diagnose a technical fault that did not exist, because no one had told them that the relevant contracts included force majeure clauses that had triggered on the declaration date. The person who knew about the force majeure clauses was in the Trade Ministry, 3 organizational layers away from the Logistics Directorate, and had not been informed that there was a Fuel Depot Working Group, because the Logistics Directorate had not communicated with the Trade Ministry before constituting the working group, because the Logistics Directorate had classified the problem as a technical maintenance issue rather than a contractual matter, because no one in the Logistics Directorate had read the relevant licensing agreements in detail, because that was the Trade Ministry's job. This is a precise illustration of how a large organization defeats itself at the seams. The problem existed at the intersection of 2 organizational domains. Each domain had a portion of the knowledge required to understand it. Neither domain communicated with the other quickly enough in the first week, and by the time the communication happened, both working groups had already committed to analytical frameworks that did not account for the other's piece of the picture. I watched this pattern replicate across working groups simultaneously. The agricultural software group made the same class of error. The medical routing group understood the contractual issue almost immediately. The medical sector had better cross-domain communication, but then spent 2 weeks debating whether the force majeure clause was legally operative given that the war declaration had targeted the human polity as a whole rather than specific contracting entities. This was a genuine legal question, not without merit, but it consumed time the supply chain did not have. The Communications Relay Working Group grasped the full scope of the problem in 4 days and issued an accurate assessment in their first formal report, but the assessment was classified at a level that prevented sharing with the other working groups for another week and a half, by which point each had independently arrived at some version of the same conclusion through more arduous routes. There is a word for this pattern: fragmentation. Not the fragmentation of weak or corrupt institutions, but the fragmentation that all large, successful institutions accumulate through specialization. Each part of the machine was very good at its own function. No part had been designed to see the whole picture, because in normal operation the whole picture did not need to be seen. It only needed to be seen when something went wrong at the level of the whole, and that was rare enough that no one had built the organizational muscle for it. I had been building exactly that muscle, in a way station that smelled of chemical treatment and processed 400 cargo transits a week, for 14 months. There was also, running beneath the administrative frustration, a second kind of difficulty that the Throne's committees kept encountering: the problem of scale. Each individual dependency, examined in isolation, looked manageable. A different fuel dispensing software could be sourced. A different agricultural planning suite could be commissioned. A different medical routing platform could be developed. Each of these was a real option, and each of them was being pursued by the relevant ministry with genuine effort. The problem was time. Sourcing different software takes months. Commissioning a new agricultural planning suite takes years. Developing a replacement medical routing platform from scratch takes longer. And none of these timelines ran in parallel because each ministry was drawing on the same pool of Throne technical contractors, and the contractors were already stretched. The Throne had built its infrastructure efficiently over 3 generations by licensing the human options rather than developing redundant alternatives. This was rational. Redundancy is expensive, and when the things you are dependent on are working reliably, the expense is difficult to justify politically. Now the Throne was paying for the efficiency of that decision, in the currency of time it did not have. I tracked the committee work in my logs. I tracked the timelines the working groups were projecting. I tracked the gap between what the Throne needed to restore its operational capacity and when the Throne could realistically restore it through its own efforts. The gap, by my calculation, was approximately 18 months. The Throne's military planners, I suspected, had arrived at a similar number, because the battle group's operational posture shifted in week 6. It did not stand down, but it stopped actively preparing for a campaign. The mobilization orders were suspended, not rescinded. The war declaration was technically still in effect, but the fleet's operational tempo dropped from active deployment preparation to what I would describe as cautious holding. A fleet that is cautiously holding is a fleet whose commanders have looked at their readiness assessments and decided that now is not the time. The sovereign herself, and I want to be clear that Vareth XIII was not a fool. She had held the throne for 19 years through 2 succession crises and 1 significant border dispute with the Rithani, and people who are not fools do not manage that, convened a full council session at the end of week 2. I did not have access to the council chamber. I had access to the administrative traffic that flowed out of it, and to a source inside the Throne's protocol office who had, over the preceding 14 months, developed an appreciation for certain human-origin beverages that I was in a position to supply, and who occasionally described things to me in terms more direct than the official traffic. What I understand happened in that council session is this. The sovereign asked her ministers to give her a current assessment of the war declaration's operational impact, and the ministers gave her one, and the assessment was not good. The first consolidated battle group was at 73% assessed readiness, not because anything had broken, but because the readiness assessment had to account for the possibility that things would break, and without the automated maintenance monitoring, the probability of failure models were running on assumptions rather than data. The Second Reach's fleet was in better shape. Its vessel classes had fewer human-licensed systems, but the supply chain for its forward operating depots ran through 3 transit corridors that were now experiencing fuel dispensing anomalies, and a fleet that cannot reliably fuel itself is not a fleet that can conduct a sustained campaign. The Merchant Interdiction Corps, designed to strangle human trade routes, had been intended to deprive the human polity of commerce. The problem, as one of the ministers apparently pointed out with some directness, was that cutting human trade routes would also cut the trade routes through which human-produced goods were currently flowing to Throne systems that needed them. This last point, I am told, produced a silence in the council chamber. The silence lasted about 20 seconds, which, in a formal Ver council session, is a very long time. Then the sovereign said something in low court language that my source in the protocol office translated for me, somewhat awkwardly, as, "We have been operating under an incorrect model of the situation." That is the most precise description of what had happened that I can offer. The Throne had been operating under an incorrect model. The model had assumed that declaring war on humanity was the beginning of a campaign. It had not considered the possibility that the human response would not be a campaign at all. There was no human fleet forming up on the border. There was no human diplomatic ultimatum. There was no human negotiator arriving with a list of demands. There was only, so far, the quiet deactivation of maintenance contracts and licensing agreements and routing platforms, and the slow, daily accumulation of small degradations in systems that the throne had come to depend on without ever formally acknowledging that it had come to depend on them. I sent my Week 2 summary with the heading, Operational Assessment Day 14. I noted the readiness figures, the supply chain anomalies, the council session, my source's account of the sovereign's remark. I was thorough. My summaries were, I was told later, the clearest picture anyone on our side had of the situation in real time, and I am not sure whether that reflects well on my work or poorly on our intelligence architecture, but either way, it is the truth. By week 6, the throne had begun making quiet approaches. I want to describe what a quiet approach from a large empire actually looks like, because it is different from what you might expect. It does not look like a communication from the sovereign's office. It does not look like a formal diplomatic channel opening. It does not look like anything, at first, that you would recognize as communication at all. What it looks like is a slight shift in the pattern of conversations at trade functions. A throne ministry official, who has always been formally correct, suddenly becoming interested in the kind of small talk that normally bores him. A question about shipping schedules that is slightly too specific to be purely conversational. A request through the Compact's arbitration registry for a routine clarification on a contract term that has not changed in 6 years. These are the sounds an empire makes when it is looking for a door that it cannot officially admit is there. Vel Sarath, the Compact's trade arbitrator, was very good at hearing them. He had spent his career between large powers, which means he had developed, through long practice, the ability to hear what was not being said while maintaining a perfectly straight face about what was being said. He had conversations. He relayed, through the Compact's standard channels, certain questions about the current status of licensing restoration procedures. He received, through those same channels, certain responses that were not quite answers, but that established the willingness to have further conversations. This process is called, in the trade, building a back channel, and it is slow and somewhat tedious and absolutely essential for situations where neither party can afford to be seen approaching the other first. I monitored all of it. Not the conversations themselves. Sarath was careful, and his channel discipline was good, but the administrative footprint, the scheduling adjustments, the meeting request logs in the Compact's registry, the slight uptick in traffic between the Compact's Drevith office and its central arbitration bureau. The picture assembled itself, as pictures do when you have been watching long enough, from fragments. The human trade representatives, I should note, were not intelligence officers. They were actual trade representatives who worked for actual firms and who had actual financial interests in the resolution of the licensing disputes. They were not running a diplomatic strategy. They were doing what trade representatives do, looking for a path back to business. But they were also, none of them, authorized to negotiate anything that touched on the war declaration itself. That was above their level. And so the conversations through the Compact went in circles for 3 weeks, because the throne wanted the licensing restored without acknowledging the war declaration was a problem, and the trade representatives could not restore the licensing without authorization that only came from a level of the human polity that was not, as yet, communicating with anyone on the throne's side through any channel I could monitor. I watched all of this and wrote my summaries and made my tea, and looked out my waystation window at the communications relay that was still running at reduced capacity, and thought about what it means to win a confrontation that no one officially acknowledges is happening. The thing about a war that begins with a declaration and then meets no army is that the declaring power has no one to fight. A declaration of war is, in its structure, the opening move in a game that requires an opponent. The throne had made its move. Humanity had, apparently, declined to play the game that the throne had assumed it was opening. The deactivated licenses were not a countermove in a war. They were just the natural consequence of the declaration under the terms of the existing agreements. The maintenance contracts had included force majeure and hostile designation clauses. Those clauses had triggered automatically when the sovereign's decree classified human nationals as enemy combatants. Nobody on the human side had ordered anything. The systems had simply done what the contracts said they would do if this happened. This was, I think, the part that the throne found most difficult to process. There was no human general to defeat. There was no human diplomatic delegation to humiliate. There was no human fleet to destroy or be destroyed by. There was only a spreading, quiet, infrastructural degradation that had no face and no voice and could not be negotiated with because it was not a negotiator. It was just math. In week 9, the sovereign's office issued a revised classification. The revised classification did not retract the war declaration, not formally, not yet, but it introduced a new category: suspended commercial adversary. Human nationals were reclassified from enemy combatants to suspended commercial adversaries, a designation that the throne's trade ministry immediately used to argue that the force majeure clauses in the licensing agreements were no longer technically triggered. And could the human firms please review their maintenance contract status at their earliest convenience? The human firms reviewed their maintenance contract status. Several of them issued inquiries through the compact asking for clarification on whether suspended commercial adversary was functionally equivalent to not at war, because their legal departments needed to know before they could restore service. The throne's trade ministry, after consultation with the sovereign's legal counsel, issued a clarification stating that suspended commercial adversary was a temporary administrative designation pending diplomatic review and should not be construed as a continuation of the war declaration, which remained officially in effect for record-keeping purposes, but was, the clarification noted, under active review by the sovereign's council. I read that clarification 3 times. Then I sent a summary with the heading, "The declaration is, in practice, dissolving." I used precise language. I did not editorialize. My job was to observe and record, and editorializing, however satisfying it might have been, was not in my job description. The licensing restorations began in week 11. Not all at once. There were legal reviews, and the human firms were appropriately cautious about restoring service under a designation that was, technically, still an enemy classification, however qualified. But the fuel dispensing systems came back first, because the fuel supply chain was the most immediately pressing problem, and because the human distribution firm involved had the simplest contract structure and the most straightforward force majeure language. The agricultural software came back in pieces, world by world, as individual licensing agreements were reviewed. The medical routing platform came back in week 13. The communications relays came back in week 14, full bandwidth. The encryption keys updated and current. The Sovereign Reach's maintenance monitoring software was the last to be restored, because naval equipment licensing involved a different ministry and a different legal framework, and because there had been some difficulty in the throne's Naval Engineering Command acknowledging, in writing, that they had been operating without it. The restoration happened in week 15, quietly, through a technical update rather than a formal announcement. I noted it in my log, Sovereign Reach Maintenance monitoring RESTORED, week 15. In week 18, the Throne's Council issued a formal statement describing the events of the previous 4 months as a period of diplomatic misalignment that had been successfully resolved through the mediation of the Rithani Merchant Compact. The war declaration was not mentioned. There was no acknowledgement that a war declaration had ever been issued. The statement praised the enduring commercial relationship between the throne and humanity's trade representatives, expressed the sovereign's personal appreciation for the professionalism of the compact's trade arbitrator, and noted that both parties were committed to a renewed framework of mutual commercial benefit. I printed that statement. I filed it next to the war declaration in my drawer. Then I began the process of closing out my posting, because there was no longer anything to monitor, and a field officer who stays in place after the situation has resolved is a field officer who is becoming a risk rather than an asset. The extract took 3 weeks to arrange. I flew out on a compact cargo ship that was running a regular circuit, and I rode in a cabin that smelled of the chemical used to preserve agricultural samples, and I read over my notes for the 14 months before the declaration and the 18 weeks after it, and I tried to understand what I had witnessed. Here is what I concluded. The throne had made a calculation. The calculation was, we are larger, we are more powerful, we have more ships and more soldiers and more territory, and therefore the outcome of a war with humanity is not in serious question, and therefore a declaration of war is a low-cost signal of dominance that will produce a diplomatic resolution on favorable terms. This is a calculation that large powers make. It is not stupid, as calculations go. History is full of smaller powers that folded when larger powers applied sufficient pressure, and the throne's history in particular was full of examples of exactly this dynamic playing out in its favor. What the calculation missed was the infrastructure question, not because the throne was careless. It was not careless. It was careful and thorough, and had been running an empire for 4 centuries. But because the infrastructure question was not the kind of question that empires ask about things that are working. You do not audit your dependencies when your dependencies are functioning. You only discover how deep they go when something removes them. Humanity had not planned for this specific confrontation. I want to be clear about that, because the temptation, looking back, is to read intentionality into what was largely accumulated circumstance. Human engineers had built good fuel dispensing software and good agricultural planning tools and good communications relay protocols and good coolant monitoring systems. And the throne had adopted them because they were good. And the force majeure clauses in the licensing agreements had been standard commercial language that any competent trade lawyer would have included, not a strategic weapon waiting to be deployed. Nobody had sat in a room and said, let us quietly make ourselves so necessary to the throne that a war declaration will immediately degrade their operational capacity. It happened because humans were good at building things and willing to sell them, and the throne was rational about adopting things that worked, and 3 generations of that dynamic had produced a dependency neither side had fully mapped. I had mapped it, that was my job. I spent 2 years after my return writing a report that I was told much later was read by exactly 7 people, one of whom requested that certain sections be reclassified at a higher level, and 2 of whom apparently disagreed with my conclusions about the intentionality question, feeling that the outcome was too neat to have been entirely accidental. I maintained my position. I had been there. I had watched it happen in real time, at the level of fuel dispensing anomaly reports and agricultural software update failures and communications relay bandwidth degradations. And at that level, looking at the actual mechanisms, there was no hidden hand and no master plan. There was only the slow, quiet weight of indispensability, doing what it does when someone tries to declare it an enemy. That is not a satisfying story. Satisfying stories have architects and strategies, and the moment when someone reveals that they knew all along. This story had a 14-month mapping project, a war declaration, a force majeure clause, and 18 weeks of bureaucratic negotiation, conducted through a neutral trading compact by people whose primary concern was their quarterly revenue figures. That is not a satisfying story. Satisfying stories have architects and strategies, and the moment when someone reveals that they knew all along. This story had a 14-month mapping project, a war declaration, a force majeure clause, and 18 weeks of bureaucratic negotiation, conducted through a neutral trading compact by people whose primary concern was their quarterly revenue figures. I sometimes think that this is precisely why the story is not told. The version that circulates in the places where these things get discussed, not publicly, not on record, but in the quiet conversations of people who work in related fields, is a cleaner version. In the cleaner version, there was a plan. Someone saw it coming. Someone made a decision. The outcome was not coincidence but design. People prefer that version because it implies that the situation is controllable, that the right people were watching, that the right choices were made at the right times by people with full information and clear intent. The cleaner version is reassuring in a way that the accurate version is not. The accurate version is this: the right people were watching. The right picture was assembled, but the outcome was not designed, it was enabled. There is a difference, and the difference matters to me, perhaps because I am the person who did the watching and I know precisely what the watching produced and what it did not produce. What it produced was a map. What happened with the map? The decision to let the commercial logic run rather than to intervene through other means, to allow the force majeure clauses to do their work without adding a political or military layer on top. That decision was made above my level, in rooms I did not have access to, by people whose reasoning I do not fully know. I am content with this. My job was to produce the clearest possible picture. Whether the picture was used wisely is not mine to judge. I can say only that the outcome, as I observed it, was proportionate to the situation and left the subsequent relationship between the throne and the human polity on a more honest foundation than it had previously occupied. The new commercial framework has better clauses. Both sides understand now the actual depth of their mutual entanglement. This is, in my view, a more stable arrangement than one built on assumptions neither side had fully tested. I think about that sometimes, sitting at my desk with the drawer that holds the two documents, the War Declaration and the Diplomatic Realignment Statement, 7 years apart in their official dates, a few centimeters apart in my drawer. I should describe the two documents, for the record, because physical detail is the kind of thing that gets lost in summaries, and I find I want the record to be complete. The War Declaration is on heavier paper. The throne prints its formal proclamations on a pressed material that has a slight texture to it, almost like cloth, and the golden seal at the top has a raised quality, the Werk equivalent of embossing. The language is high court, the formal register that the throne uses for its most important pronouncements, and it is dense and ornate and carries, even in translation, the weight of 4 centuries of institutional authority. The cipher block is correct, the formatting is correct, the listing of military assets to be mobilized is precise and comprehensive. It is, as official documents go, an excellent example of the form. Someone at the throne's protocol office worked very hard on it. The Diplomatic Realignment Statement is on lighter stock. It was printed for release to the commercial news services and carries the tone of those documents, businesslike, forward-looking, studiously unconcerned with the past. It mentions the Rithani Merchant Compact's mediation in warm terms. It mentions the renewed commercial framework in warm terms. It mentions, in one careful subordinate clause, the need for robust technical dependency review provisions in future licensing agreements, without specifying what had made such provisions necessary, without noting that anyone had spent 4 months discovering why they were necessary, without acknowledging that a document existed, printed on heavier paper, with a raised seal, that made the history of those 4 months very clear. The War Declaration is on top, as I think it should be. I take it out occasionally, not out of any sentiment. I am not a sentimental man. 14 months in a way station watching shipping manifests will cure that, but because it is useful to remember what the actual sequence was. The throne declared war first. Everything that followed was consequence. Not response, not retaliation, not the human polity doing anything aggressive or even deliberate. Consequence. The contracts executed their terms. The math ran. The Sovereign Reach completed its next major service cycle without incident. Her secondary drive array was in good condition, maintenance records current, all monitoring systems nominal. I know this because the same technical specification channels I had been monitoring during my posting continued to generate traffic for years after, and I had left my relay tap in place when I extracted, because you never know what will be useful, and because my case number had been kept active as a low-priority passive collection account, and because I am, at heart, a thorough person. The Throne and the human polity have a new commercial framework now. It has better drafted clauses on both sides. The Throne's trade ministry added a technical dependency review requirement to all future licensing agreements, not publicly acknowledged as a response to the events of 7 years ago, because the events of 7 years ago are not acknowledged publicly, but present in the new standard contract language if you know what you are looking for. Humanities trade lawyers added a clarity provision to the force majeure clauses, specifying precisely what triggers them and what the restoration process looks like. This was described, in the commercial press that covered the new framework, as a routine modernization of standard contract terms. I read that coverage and felt something that I am willing to call, in the privacy of my own assessment, a certain dry satisfaction, not triumph, not pride. The work was not mine in any meaningful sense. I was a watcher, an accumulator of data, a man who sat in a way station for 14 months and made tea and wrote careful summaries. The outcome was not something I produced. It was something I described. But there is a particular kind of professional satisfaction that comes from having described something accurately, in real time, to the right people, with enough precision that the description was useful. I had done that. The summaries had been read. The map I had made of the Throne's dependencies had informed, at some level, the decisions that the appropriate people made about whether to make a formal issue of the war declaration or to simply let the commercial logic run. I do not know what those decisions were, or who made them, or in what room. That is not my clearance level, and it was not then, and I have made my peace with that. You do not, in this work, get to know everything. You get to know your part. My part was to watch. I watched a large empire make a calculation that was not unreasonable given the information available to the people making it. I watched that calculation encounter something that the calculation had not modeled. Not a fleet, not an army, not a diplomatic response, but the quiet, structural fact of what happens when you declare enemy status against the people who maintain your infrastructure. I watched the empire reverse its course through the mechanisms available to it: reclassification, restatement, mediation through a neutral party, and I watched it do so without ever formally acknowledging what had happened, which is, in my experience, how large empires handle things that do not fit the stories they tell about themselves. The official record of the Throne now shows a period of diplomatic misalignment, resolved through mediation, followed by a renewed commercial framework. The war declaration is not there. The force majeure cascade is not there. The sovereign's 20-second silence in the council chamber is not there. The week 15 quiet restoration of the Sovereign Reach's maintenance monitoring software is not there. I have the copy of the original declaration in my drawer, next to the diplomatic realignment statement. The two documents together are, if you know what you are looking at, the complete story. They are also about 8 inches of fiber paper in a drawer, in an office, in a building that does not appear on any public directory. I am, I think, the only person who keeps both copies together. Everyone else who was involved has filed them in separate places, in separate institutional memories, under separate classification headings. The people in the Trade Ministry have the contract records. The people in the Naval Directorate have the readiness assessments. The people in the Sovereign's Protocol Office have the revised classification documents. The Arbitration Bureau has the mediation correspondence. Each piece is accurate. Each piece is complete within its own domain. None of them, taken alone, tells you what actually happened. I find I do not mind being the one who holds the whole picture. That is what the work was always for in the end. Not the action, not the intervention, not the moment when someone makes a decision and history turns on it, but the complete, accurate, cross-referenced account of what actually happened and in what order and why. The record. The real one, not the official one. There is a skill in this profession to understanding what a thing is before anyone has decided what to call it. The throne declared war. The official record says they did not. Both statements are true in different senses at different levels of resolution. The war happened. The war also, in a certain light, never happened because nothing that a war is supposed to produce, victory, defeat, treaty, territory, materialized. What materialized was an infrastructure problem that was resolved through commercial negotiation. I was the only person, in a room that was technically a way station office, who knew while it was happening what it was. The committees and the ministers and the admirals were looking at anomaly reports and fuel depot malfunctions and readiness assessments. The trade representatives and the compact arbitrator were looking at contract language and quarterly projections. The sovereign and her council were looking at a strategic problem they had no template for. I was looking at all of it. That was my job. I sent my final summary from Waystation Drevith on the morning of my extraction, a summary marked close of posting and stamped with the case number that had no name. And in the summary's concluding section, I wrote the following, which I did not usually do because summary reports are not the place for conclusions, but which I felt, on the last day, was warranted. The conflict resolved because the declaring power could not sustain the operational cost of the declaration. The cost was not military. It was infrastructural. The declaring power had more ships and more soldiers than the declared against party, and none of that mattered because what it needed to use those ships and soldiers was being quietly, incrementally withdrawn by the commercial logic of the licensing agreements it had signed in better times. A declaration of war against a commercially embedded adversary is not the beginning of a war. It is the beginning of a process of discovering what you actually depend on. The report was read by 7 people. Whether any of them found the concluding section useful, I was never told. I kept a copy in my drawer, next to the war declaration and the diplomatic realignment statement. 3 documents now in a drawer beside my desk, in an office in a building that does not appear on any public directory. The declaration, the realignment, the conclusion, the whole picture in the right order. I am a thorough person. Someone should hold it, and it might as well be me.